And we are back with more Midnight in the Desert for the next 2 hours. We'll be talking now with our guest, J.P. Hague, about the multidimensionality and meaning of unidentified aerial phenomena with some tales from the Indian Ocean. And that's actually where our guest is joining us from. J.P. Hague is a practicing English lawyer who has experienced unusual and extrasensory phenomena throughout his life. He is the national director of MUFON in Mauritius. I'll have him tell you how to pronounce it correctly, and runs ufology in the area as well. Upon moving to London, England, to the tropical island, he began to consistently experience and interact with, in particular, unidentified aerial phenomena of a multidimensional nature. He actively researches, advocates, and writes about the subject and its intrinsic connection to the mysteries through a balanced approach and mindset. He considers esoterism, spirituality, and science to all be the right tools and lenses for a better understanding of the layers of reality that surround and interact with us, worlds within worlds. So strap on your seatbelt because this one is going to get strange. Good evening, JP. How are you?
Good evening, Tim. Good evening to all your listeners here in Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Thank you for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So Mauritius is the way to say it.
That's right. It's Mauritius. It comes from the Latin term, which was given to the island, by the Dutch when they arrived in the 17th century. And it was actually named after one of the 5 Dutch ships that arrived here in that fateful September of that year after having got lost. And it was actually named after the Prince of Orange, Maurits, who was basically the ruler of all the Dutch provinces in Holland at the time.
So I think we'll definitely be discussing some of the history and some of the strange history of Mauritius as we go along. But how did you get involved in this kind of research?
Yeah, it was really, I suppose, triggered by personal experience and natural curiosity. I suppose that, like you mentioned in my introduction, little strange things had happened to me as I was growing up that were beyond the normal. And I didn't really try to explain it too much. I just assumed that these things were part and parcel of life as we know it, Jim. But as I grew, it became clear that it wasn't. And it was, I would say, in late 2010 to maybe the opening months of 2011, when I was living and working in London with my then fiancée, and we were walking back from a cinema in central London. We'd just seen a film. I can't even remember if it was a science fiction film. But anyway, I was deep into the research of the UFO phenomena because an engineer friend of mine had shown me some images of what appeared to be etheric or sort of partially manifested what I can only describe are spaceships in the cosmos, and that this may have been leaked footage from the Hubble telescope or some other apparatus of which we're not aware. And my immediate reaction was, this is amazing. How did they Photoshop it? I didn't believe that the phenomena was real at the time. But it was as I began to really challenge myself and research the subject, I realized that there was a genuine information block and that it was around the hegemony of the Western world countries, such as the US and my home country of the UK. And I just kept researching. And I got to the point where intellectually, on a balance of probabilities, which is the civil burden of proof in a civil case in English law, I imagine it's similar in the States. On a balance of probabilities, I was convinced that the phenomena was real, but there was still something deep within me that sat very uncomfortably because it just seemed so far-fetched. So anyway, as I mentioned, we're walking back from the cinema on a winter's afternoon. The sky was clear blue as they come. It was beautiful weather. It was chilly because it was the winter. And we're walking on a fairly elevated hill down to where we live in a place called Maida Vale in central London. And I asked myself in my head, is this phenomena real or not? I just want to know. And the moment I mentally thought these words, an object began to pulse in and out of reality. And I know that it took physicality because this thing was metallic appearance, and it was reflecting the sunlight. So it definitely took a physicality. But the strange thing was that it was manifesting or materializing and then dematerializing. And it must have pulsed around up to five times. And in the end, I was stood in the middle of the road, with my mouth wide open, just watching this thing that apparently had appeared at the very moment that I'd asked the question, is this phenomena real or not? And my wife, or then fiancée, was stood next to me, but she didn't quite capture what I had seen because she was walking on a pavement which was basically an avenue lined by trees. So that was the first real sighting that I had, and that took place in London, UK, which, by the way, is some of the most heavily controlled and regulated airspace in the world.
Well, I mean, just that, the process of what was going on alone opens up all kinds of questions and possibilities because, seeing it pulse in and out of an existence, that doesn't sound like a physical craft coming from another place. That sounds like something that is able to go from one place to another fairly quickly.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And that's what blew my mind, because the sky was like a perfect backdrop, as if you were looking at one of these old oil paintings that are just so real. It was really perfect visibility, and there was nothing there. Then it was pulsed and phased into reality. It's reflecting the sunlight. So in order to reflect the sunlight, I'm assuming that there is a physical aspect to it. And I wasn't actually aware of any telepathic aspect to the phenomena until obviously after that experience, where I vigorously researched this. And this often is the case. I mean, the famous UFO researcher and historian Richard Dolan himself has had an experience where he lives in Rockhampton in New York State. And I recall him having a very similar experience in terms of the telepathic element. He was thinking about the subject, or perhaps even asking a question, I don't quite recall, and then this thing appears in the sky. So it was a really a powerful first experience that happened in highly controlled airspace, where there are aircraft flying over all the time. I mean, if you go out to the west of central London to a beautiful park called Richmond Park, that's very closely situated to London Heathrow International Airport. And at any one time, you can see perhaps up to 7 aircraft in a perfect line coming into land. So I realized that this wasn't normal. It was far too low and would have presented a danger, I imagine, to overhead air traffic had it been some form of conventional aircraft or other apparatus. But it was an amazing experience, and it happened in such a clear and unequivocal way. So then for me, the sort of personal evidence or proof was there. I mean, evidence is a very subjective thing. I mean, what is evidence for one person may not be to another. But as a lawyer, I always try to encourage people to think about evidence as if you're in a court of law. In a civil court of law, as I mentioned earlier, we look at what is called the balance of probabilities. It doesn't have to be certain, but on a balance of probabilities, which, if we want to put it into percentage term, which would be over 50%, I suppose, if you were the judge, you have to come to a finding and conclusion and rule one way or the other. In a criminal case, law case, as you probably know, the standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. So I wasn't beyond reasonable doubt, but I certainly was persuaded on a balance of probabilities that it was real. And from there on, it just became a way to really focus and hone in on the research. Why the physicality, then the non-physicality or other dimensional aspect, and how is it possible to perhaps have a telepathic or mental interaction with the phenomena that appears at that specific moment in time. And as I am sat here now, I personally don't believe in coincidences. I don't think there's, there are coincidences in the sort of mundane, profane sense of the term, but when it comes to the phenomena, what I've found out, and this sails very closely to Jungian type theory or analysis, there is this co-dependency, co-creationary type element to the phenomena. And I personally believe that, we are as interested in it as it is as interested in us.
Yeah, and absolutely, that seems to be at least the way that I feel about it from hearing a lot of these stories anecdotally. I've only had a couple of UFO sightings in my life, but I'm pretty sure that, it wasn't just me happening to see something in the sky. I think in both cases there was a reason behind it. But anyway, that's a story for another time. With being a lawyer, I think that brings a very interesting set of eyes into these experiences, because you're going through, not that, you have to apply the principles of law to everything that happens, but, you're applying the same type of rationale to these experiences. And as you had said, in a lot of court cases, the idea is that you have to prove that it's more probable than not. And it seems like with the information that's been coming about these type of craft over the years, you'd have to say that it seems more probable than not.
Yes, I agree. And actually, I would now say that it's undeniable. If, you're, say, for example, just a general member of the public with no particular interest in the phenomena, but presumably, you're an active member of society, you're reading the press, and the most obvious thing that comes to mind is the New York Times release on the Tic Tac UFO and Gimbal event that happened in 2004, November 2004 from memory. And, what we have, as you probably all and your listeners well know, is F-18, Super Hornet fighter jet gun site footage of physical craft performing feats and defying the laws of physics in ways that are inexplicable or unimaginable for, the average observer. It then seems to have come from official sources and footage from the U.S. Air Force that has been very carefully and leaked in a controlled way, making itself into the New York Times. And so then it's really just a question of are they here, whatever they are or it is, but who are they? Why are they here? What does it mean for us? So, I know for a fact that this is the subject in boardrooms now. I have people, colleagues and people I know in various industries that do discuss this kind of thing. And, we can only imagine the heights of knowledge and fear perhaps within the high levels of government and beyond that into the murky world of intelligence. So it is something that I consider to be undeniable in terms of there are UFOs. Then, in fact, they're still unidentified in the sense that we're trying to still work out what they are, but we can't deny that they are here and that, on that same balance of probabilities based on the number of witnesses that are actually courageous enough to come forward, we might be looking at millions of people on a planet of 7 billion. And that in itself would be interesting to fathom in terms of what kind of percentage or how many people on the face of this earth are actually having these experiences but not talking about them, and what does it really mean in terms of the bigger picture? Is it an ecosystem, for example, that is self-regulating, perhaps a little bit like human society here on Earth? So it does raise all manner of interesting questions.
Oh, sure. And one of the most interesting facets of this is that now that, the paranormal discussion is more out in the open, I'm finding that a lot of people who have had UFO sightings, they might not remember or they might not have been so willing to admit it, but you find out that they had other paranormal experiences in their lives before their UFO sightings.
Yes. And I mean, that was the case, very much the case for me. Before I moved here to Mauritius in the deep South Indian Ocean, and I mean, there's nothing between Mauritius and the Antarctic. We're in a tropical environment, and I don't know if you can hear the tropical rainstorm passing overhead, but it's a very isolated and an unusual place. But as I mentioned, the first experiences of this phenomena and other, let's say, paranormal phenomena in in my life happened in the UK. And in fact, it started just before moving to Mauritius back in the end of 2012 and the beginning of 2013. We were, at the time, looking to move out of central London because we were expecting our newborn daughter. And we found a beautiful Victorian house that was built in the 1900s in a town called East Grinstead, which is about an hour south of, or southwest of London in my home county of West Sussex. But it was a convenient location. It was close to, fairly close to London. And there's a beautiful forest nearby. And it's also a very unusual place. There is allegedly a ley line that runs through this site. There's a number of strange incidents that have occurred, which I can go into in a short while. And it also happens to be the home of the world, or if not the UK and European headquarters of Scientology, which is interesting. There's a large manor house that's 2 or 3 miles away from where we'd bought our home, where the founder, L. Ron Hubbard, lived. And it's a huge compound with an old house. It's opened up every so often now and then for the public and obviously for the Scientologists attending. Now, there is a strange occurrence that happened at or around New Year of 2011. And this happened nearby to Gatwick Airport, or London Gatwick Airport, which, by the way, is nowhere near London. It's in my home county of West Sussex, and in London is about 70 miles away. But East Grinstead and the Scientology headquarters is no more than a few miles away from the airport. And this, there was an incident that happened at the end of 2011 that reached the national press in, I think I remember reading it in the Daily Mail at the time, which is a national newspaper. But to cut a long story short, there were something like up to 6 British Airways commercial jets that were coming into land, and the pilots were seeing up to something like 6 silver metallic discs, so, flying saucers. At the same time, the radar had picked up the same thing, and all pilots and the radar picked this phenomena up over the Scientology headquarters, which was just a few miles away down the road. So, there's a lot of mystery to this place. I suspect that the ley lines are natural, unseen energies that probably emanate from the Earth, but perhaps it allows these multidimensional intelligences or objects, if that's what they are, to actually help them to manifest. So there could be this natural energetic system that they are able to use in order to transcend from one dimension to another. It may be that they can just do this technologically themselves, either through craft or even inherently within the beings or intelligence themselves. There's so many questions that come from this. But anyway, we moved into this property in this strange location. And even prior to buying that house, when we were looking for a house, I experienced, I suppose, my first apparition or ghost. It was absolutely incredible. We were looking at an old coach house, which was at least 100 years old at the time. And we went to view the property at around midday. So it was, a very sunny day. There was nothing strange about the weather. There was no strange circumstances. We literally had the appointment at midday. And we met the owner, who seemed a little bit nervous. She was a, nice lady, but she just seemed a little bit on edge, and I wasn't really sure why. But it soon became apparent why. I mean, we went into one of the bedrooms on the first floor. It was a small bedroom, and the owner walked in. So did my wife. The sun was actually coming in through the window, and then I entered the room. The first thing I noticed was that there appeared to be thick or heavy dust that was just sitting in the air. And as I looked, I even said to them, this is a really dusty room. This is a very old house that hasn't been cleaned. And anyway, no sooner had I spoken the words, the dust appeared to quicken or vibrate, which was extremely strange. It began to quicken and vibrate so much that the outline of an object or a person began to take shape. And I then realized that what I was looking at was the image of a woman, or the outline of a woman, in what I can only describe as white robes. It was like a being of light in white robes. This entity then approach me and walk through me. And what I was surprised to see it in the first place, but in terms of the five senses, it wasn't cold like a lot of paranormal or ghost investigations seem to suggest. In fact, it was the opposite. It was warm. I felt an electrostatic type energy around my face, and it felt quite pleasant. It was extremely weird, and I was just shocked. I asked my wife and the owner if they'd seen anything, and they said no, but at that point I realized why the owner had been a little bit nervous as we entered, because she was trying to sell a house that was haunted, obviously. And she was and I said, look, I've busted you, but is this the reason why you're selling the house? And she said, yes, we hear a disembodied voice, we see lights in the bedroom at night, there's banging and all sort of other strange things, but we've never seen an apparition, but we feel like we're being watched, and it makes us feel uncomfortable. So I said, well, thank you so much for trying to pass that little gift on to us, but I don't think we'll be buying this house. So that was the home before we actually bought the house that I spoke about a few moments earlier. In the end, we did buy a haunted house, but I didn't pick it up at the time. So there was all this strange paranormal phenomena going on just prior and during after the arrival of my now 7-year-old daughter. For the house that we did buy, it was only apparent to me that there was activity in the house maybe a month or so after we bought it, because we basically renovated it and put in a new kitchen in the downstairs. And it was only when we were staying over as the work was being done that I began to hear coughing in the chimney. It was sort of coming from the dining room chimney, or fireplace, sorry, and it was traveling up to the guest bedroom fireplace. So I could hear a man coughing in the dead of night, and instinctively I knew it was probably paranormal because there was nobody else in the house. But I was just too scared to tell my wife, who was heavily pregnant at the time. But in the end, it became so manifest and abundant, I couldn't really hide it from anybody. I mean, there were occasions, like out of probably a science fiction film, where you would be in the kitchen, you walk out for several seconds to half a minute, say, you walk back into the kitchen and all the cupboards and drawers were open, which is impossible. I would change my daughter at 2 a.m. in the morning in her nursery, and the electrics would just cut out. And as the electrics cut out, I'm hearing the chairs and stools in the newly refurbished kitchen being pulled from underneath the breakfast bar table overlooking the garden. There would be banging underneath the master bedroom in the dead of night. I would walk in and see my daughter, whether it's in the day or in the night as she was waking to be fed or cared for, and I would see these thin, tall pillars of light just sort of next to her cot. It was very, very strange, and I do wonder whether this phenomena, and indeed all phenomena, when we look at the kind of research of Jacques Vallée, is really united and all conducted through forms of energy that are perhaps stronger in certain parts of the planet than others, which, by the way, would include Mauritius, and we can get into that a bit later.
No, absolutely. But we have about a minute here before we go to the break, but I think that is something you brought up, something that was very interesting when you mentioned the ley lines, and I think that is probably something that does factor into all this. I don't know if I necessarily buy into all of the different things that people say that ley lines are responsible for, but I certainly think that it definitely seems to have a power for certain things, and there's a reason why you find these ideas of where ley lines might be crossing over with these areas that we call paranormal vortexes.
Yes, I agree. I think you're right. I think that the phenomena is independent in and of itself, but it is possible that the ley lines have an incidence or let's say boost the ability for these entities or intelligences to actually manifest. We don't really know, but it's very, very interesting. And by the way, I mentioned the Scientology headquarters being just down the road. One of its greatest proponents, as you know, is the famous actor Tom Cruise, and he actually, for a time, moved into the town. So there was a hell of a lot of mystery and focus on this relatively small provincial town where there has been a lot of paranormal activity. And the ley line in particular that runs through East Grinstead runs from the north to the south. I'm not so sure if there's one that's, I believe is called the St. Michael Line, which runs through Glastonbury Tor in the west of England, and that sort of passes through the south of the UK on a horizontal trajectory. But I think that it's more of the vertical ley line, one of the vertical ley lines that passes through East Grinstead.
All right, well, we are going to take a break. When we come back on the other side, we'll continue more in our discussion with J.P. Hague. We'll get into some of the cases happening in Mauritius as well. If you have any questions during the program, just shoot them into the wormhole at midnightinthedesert.com. That's for all of you time travelers out there. If you're not a time traveler, you can email me, Tim at midnightinthedesert.com. But why not be a time traveler? Because you're going to want to go back and listen to this show again. I promise you that. We'll be back with more Midnight in the Desert coming up in just a few moments. Stay tuned.
Hey there, it's Tim, the new host of Midnight in the Desert, and I want to thank everybody for all your great words of encouragement and support as I've taken over the hosting duties of the show on a full-time basis, but we need a little bit more from you. No, I'm not going to ask you to step in and help me host the show. I think I've got that part covered myself, but what I do need from you is to help us spread the word about Midnight in the Desert. What we need you to do is go to Facebook, like the official Midnight in the Desert page, like the posts that we put up every day, share them around with your network of people, tell your friends about the show, follow us on Twitter at MITD_show, retweet the tweets when we put them out every day. That will help us really get people knowing about the show. And also you can join the Midnight Society, our listener group on Facebook as well. And the ultimate way to help support the show, become a time traveler by signing up for just $4.99 a month at midnightinthedesert.com. We do this show because we love it, but we want you to listen to it because you love it too.
Back in on Midnight in the Desert, and we are talking with J.P. Hague about multidimensionality and the meaning of unidentified aerial phenomena with some tales from the Indian Ocean. And as we talk about these UAPs and we talk about the possibility of alien life, don't forget that the March book for the Midnight Society Book Club is Voices from the Cosmos by Dr. Angela T. Smith. If you go to midnightinthedesert.com, you can click on it there and you can pick up a copy of the book, whether it be a physical copy or an ebook version, and you can read along with it and discuss it in the chat in the Midnight Society on Facebook, which is linked up right at midnightinthedesert.com on our social media links, so you can take part in that discussion as you read the book. Well, we are talking with J.P. Hague, and we've been talking about the island of Mauritius a little bit, and one of the questions that I have about this, I looked at a map during the break, and I looked at, where Mauritius is, and judging by it being, it's kind of it's close to Madagascar, close to the coast of Africa. What are some of the belief systems of the people that live on the island there?
Yes, well, look, Mauritius has a relatively recent known human history that dates back to the 1500s. The island was initially a trading point for Arab traders from modern-day Oman, and it was then used as a stop-off point by the Portuguese on the spice trading route. But it wasn't colonized. It was literally just a stopping point, and the Portuguese harbored in Mozambique. After this point in time, in the 1600s, and like I mentioned in the introduction, in the year of 1598, the Dutch arrived. They basically colonized the island for at least 100 years. It wasn't particularly successful. There was lots of disease and maladministration, and in the end, they abandoned the island. They did introduce the sugarcane industry here. They did manage to deforest huge amounts of the southern part of the island. They were, said to have made extinct the dodo bird, which is famous for being extinct. And as we understand it, Mauritius was the only location on Earth where the dodo bird existed. So that really was the only true indigenous animal or being on the island in terms of relatively recent history. So after the Dutch left, the French arrived. There was a 10-year gap between the Dutch leaving and the French arriving, and the slavery trade was continued, and slaves were used to work in the sugarcane fields and basically serve the colonial masters of the French at the time. And I suppose that much like many other French colonies, it was more about a cultural colonization rather than simply for trade and commerce, which is more characteristic of how the British operated. And there used to be the expression that the sun never set on the British Empire. Whilst we find colonialization and slavery deplorable in our day and age, it was very much the thing to do back then. So the French were on the island for over 100 years too, and due to the sort of naval and military significance of the location and the skirmishes that were happening between French so-called corsairs, who were basically merchant sailors and traders who were militarized and used to skirmish with the British and disrupt British shipping, the British decided that they were going to attack Mauritius and take it over. So, it was a pretty incredible feat that they pulled off. There were some 10,000 British troops that disembarked in the north of the island, and they overwhelmed perhaps some 2,000 French soldiers here on the island. And from that point on the 29th of November in 1810, Mauritius became a British colony up until independence in 1968. Now, during this period, slavery was abolished. I mean, the slaves were originally from, as you would imagine, African countries, particularly Madagascar and elsewhere. After slavery was abolished, and I think illegal slavery was continued for some 30 years after that, the British came up with this so-called Great Experiment, which was, equally concerning, whereby they took on free labor, and that was called indentured labor. So basically, this Great Experiment took place in, I think, around 1836, and many convicts at the time were brought over from India and basically comprised the workforce for the sugarcane fields at the time. They entered into a contract with the British government, and in exchange they were given transport to the colony and work for a fixed period. So this was called indentured labor. And in fact, there was a location in the capital called Apravasi Ghat, which is quite an interesting immigration dock in Port Louis, which is the capital of the island. And this really became the center for indentured labor, or laborers who arrived from India throughout the world. And this system of free labor was exported to Reunion Island, which is around 100 or so miles off the west coast, and that's owned by France, to Africa, Australia, I believe, the Caribbean. And all in all, there were some 500,000 indentured laborers being brought to Mauritius alone between around 1834 to 1920. So, it was a significant and difficult part of Mauritian history. But with that came the African and Indian cultures and religions that very much dominate the island. So the vast majority of the population are Hindu-based, and they originate from those indentured laborers that were first brought here, and they tend to be Hindu in faith. The slave colonies from before primarily originated from Africa, and they're more associated with Christianity, be it Catholic or Church of England, I believe. So the Hindu population is approximately around 40 to 43% from memory. The Creole population around 23%. There are Muslim faith members of society. There is also Sino-Mauritians that originate from China, who came here as traders and came a bit later on. So it's a real melting pot of culture and religion. I think around the time of independence, when the British gave up the colony in 1968, and by the way, yesterday marked Independence Day, so it was in March of 1968 that this happened. There were racial and religious tensions, which is very sad, but there is a lot more tolerance and harmony now, as I'm glad to report, on the island. So there is a lot of cultural, religious conditioning that's going on here. There is also a lot of spirituality, but unfortunately I sense that there is more religious conditioning and beliefs that separate people rather than bring them together, albeit it's peaceful. There is no violence as we've not seen since before independence. But it's everybody's different. I grew up in the Church of England, for example, in the UK, but I wouldn't consider myself to be religious as such. I take the wisdom teachings from certain religions. I think a lot of the religions are telling us esoteric and spiritual truths in a veiled sense. It's not necessarily meant to be read in a literal sense. But I think that's been partly the problem here, in terms of those who do see objects are very concerned about stigma and taboo, and the sort of rigid aspects and structure of society that happen through religion and cultural conditionings. I mean, within the Hindu system of belief, there's often applied the caste system, which is, in my opinion, very racist, because it's basically saying that some people are untouchable, others are superior, and that's unacceptable in today's day and age, without getting too political or controversial about it. It's just the way it is. So I think that the phenomena, in a way, is useful to help people to come out of the known sphere of religion and belief systems, to actually just put everything aside and say, look, this is happening. There is probably a science and a spiritual aspect to it. Does religion give us sufficient coordinates or cardinal points in order to understand this? And the answer is probably no in and of itself. I think it's a multidisciplined approach that needs to dissect and try and understand this phenomena. And by the way, I mean, I was going into the history of Mauritius. There's something quite interesting in terms of the relationship between the United States, where I know most of our listeners are today, and Mauritius, which is little known. Basically, in 1872, there was a gentleman named Nicholas Pike, who was apparently the first ever U.S. envoy to a foreign country, and he came to Mauritius. And some say that this was, I guess, an acknowledgement of the island's contribution to the War of Independence that took place in the States between 1775 and 1783. And he basically described Mauritius as the gem of the Indian Ocean, but it's little known to the world at large. And that's very much how it feels a little bit now, living here on a small island of around 40 miles in length, 30 miles in width, and a population of just over 1 million people. But at the time, Mauritius was used by the French, who were governing the island at the time, to, as I said earlier, to sabotage the British shipping. And in fact, there was a formidable French admiral called Admiral Suffren, who came to Mauritius and spent a lot of time here. But he also was known to disrupt the British in this region of the world. He distracted and weakened the British in India. And I think that in May of 1780, there were 2 French convoys that left France, one with 5,000 troops that were destined for Newport in the USA. And then the other group came to Mauritius. And Suffren, this French admiral, was thereafter known in Newport as the winner of Newport, after he destroyed, I think it was around 5 British battleships. And that was in August of 1778. And it was Captain Mahan of the US Navy that basically described this French admiral as one of the greatest in history, and compared him to the likes of Napoleon and Nelson. So there is this interesting relationship, international diplomatic friendship and relationship between Mauritius and the United States. And further still, there is actually a permanent US embassy that's based in Mauritius, which is quite unusual for a relatively small country. I mean, the British were the last to occupy the island, but there is no British embassy. There is a High Council, which performs consular and relationship type functions, but there's nothing really of any substance here, which I find to be a bit odd, whereas the US has a heavy administrative presence here. So, look, there's a lot going on in a relatively small space in that sense, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and I find that interesting.
Well, also, isn't Mauritius rumored to be part of a lost continent too?
Yes, it is. It is, Tim. I mean, what we see here are, remnants of the dodo bird, There was the only it was the only location on Earth where the dodo emanated, and we think that this bird disappeared around 400 years ago. I mean, the DNA evidence, and by the way, talking about the natural history really links into the ancient lost continent history, so I'm going to just briefly touch on that first. And I mean, the closest living creature to this dodo bird is the Nicobar pigeon, which is a sort of glossy feathered thing. It was a ground-dwelling pigeon from Southeast Asia. And the theories as to how the dodo actually may have come here, which came before this Nicobar pigeon, is fairly unsatisfactory. I mean, there are those that say that it island hops from Southeast Asia all the way down to Mauritius, which is part of the Mascarene Islands. And really, the picture is quite blurry, and the unique DNA of this creature is pretty much a mystery. Like I said, the Dutch were said to have made extinct the dodo bird because they ate it and they deforested the area. But from what we know, the meat of this bird was pretty inedible and didn't taste very nice. So, that's questionable too in terms of the mainstream history or recent history of the island. So, there is this curiosity. What we know about the neighboring island of Madagascar is that they too had very unusual, had an unusual natural history. There was the so-called elephant bird that lived on that particular part of the region, and that became extinct around 1,000 years BC. So, the strange thing is that this thing is related to the kiwi bird, which is in New Zealand. So there was a very confused natural history that doesn't quite make sense, but connects to the origins and the migration of the dodo bird that was uniquely found in Mauritius. So in terms of the more ancient aspect of where we are, there is an ancient continent that's buried underneath the Indian Ocean. In 2013, there was the first research that was conducted, and they said that about 750 million years ago, the Earth's landmass was gathered into a vast single continent called Rodinia. And I think it was published in Nature Geoscience, I want to say 2013, early 2013. This research revealed that hundreds of submerged islands were detected in the surrounding suboceanic region of Mauritius. And it even went as far to suggest that an entire lost continent located in Africa, primarily around Madagascar and India, between 2,000 and 85 million years old, existed. And they even named it Mauritia, after the island's name of Mauritius. And so basically this continent lies hidden beneath the ocean floor. Eventually this lost continent of Mauritia eventually fragmented, it vanished beneath the waves, and the modern world began to take shape, the world that we know now. What is interesting from the research is that they were using elements or minerals called zircons to actually date this stuff. And what the science says is that it's a volcanic island. I should mention that. It's very important. The grains of the volcanic layer, or the top layer of the island, are dated to around 9 million years old. And that's what the zircons, this mineral, is telling us in the analysis. But the layer beneath that is something like 2,000 to 600 million years old, if we're looking at this particular lens of scientific research. So, it's absolutely ancient. There was another sort of layer or series of research that happened in 2017 that was conducted by a South African university called Witwatersrand, and they came to a similar kind of conclusion. They found they looked for the zircons, this tough mineral that contains uranium and thorium, and these zircons can last billions of years. So they really do think that these can accurately date the rocks. The latest research in 2017 says that the zircons were as old as 3 billion years old, so far, far older than the initial research of 2013 that I've just mentioned before. But they did agree that the surface volcanic rock of the island is no older than 9 million years old. So there is a kind of point of agreement on that. And what I would suggest, based on all the research and literature and folklore, is that this ancient continent was actually Lemuria. I mean, there are myths of Lemuria in this region of the world that circulate well before, these scientific discoveries. And I do believe that there is some sort of widespread confusion or misnomer or naming between Mu, which was situated, or a lost continent situated in the Pacific, and Lemuria, which was here in the Indian Ocean, because often I hear that these terms are used interchangeably, and I think that may be a mistake. And in fact, the evidence is really in the name itself. The word Lemuria is etymologically Malgache, i.e. from Madagascar, and that basically means the souls of the departed. So Madagascar, as you mentioned earlier, Tim, is a very large island off the west coast. It's been made famous by the wonderful animated films that my children and I and my wife enjoy.
Right.
And made famous by a particular character called Julian, who is a lemur. So now we know that Lemuria, or Lemur, means a soul of the departed. These animals actually spread throughout Asia and Africa by a land bridge, according to the ancient history and myths of Lemuria, which is why they are on Madagascar now. And in the early 20th century, there was a British zoologist called Philip Sclater who basically noted the geographic distribution of these lemurs. So there has been a lot of research into this, and I find it to be quite interesting. If, in terms of visualizing Lemuria, if you can imagine Madagascar on the left-hand side, you've got Mauritius that's just off to the right of it. If you take a sort of shape of a triangle, Madagascar is on the bottom left, is the bottom left angle of the triangle. The top of the triangle, the pinnacle of the pyramid, hits India and Sri Lanka, and then the bottom right point of the triangle would hit Australia. So it was an enormous area of landmass, and the idea of Lemuria also ties into the Tamil and Dravidian myths from India of a place called Kumari Kandam or Kumari Nadu. And it's broadly the same region that we're talking about here, according to both legends or myths. There are authors, I want to cite, Jules Herman of Reunion Island. There was a guy called Robert Edward Hart from England, and a very famous esoterist and Mauritian writer and artist who was really a luminary in this area called Malcolm de Chazal. And he wrote extensively about this lost continent, as did the mystic, who's quite well known, Helena Petrova Blavatsky. So it is very interesting. There are mountains that have very unusual shapes, and in fact faces that have been carved into them, intricately carved into the mountain face. And I don't think this is really being looked at by the mainstream, let alone the alternative researchers, although I'm starting to talk about it with those who are quite active in the field. I've had really good conversations about this with the likes of Brian Forster, who I met recently at the Laughlin UFO mega conference, and he's very well known for his excellent research into the elongated skulls of Paracas in Peru and the Paracas culture. So I'm hoping that he's going to come over and we can do some research on this. But there's so many strange-looking mountains with faces carved into them. There's one called the Morn, which is a large mountain on the south coast, and it's actually UN, UNESCO World Heritage Site protected property or a landmark, and there is a face that looks out from the southern tip over the ocean. There's another mountain called the Corps de Garde, which has a very long sort of shaped skull, a large nose, and a mouth, again, that's looking over towards the west coast. There is a very highly active UFO site called Tamarin, or Tamarin, as we'd say in French. And there's a mountain there called Montagne du Rempart. And this is almost like a gorilla's head. It's very, very long, and the mouth and the nose are very large. And again, this thing is looking over to out towards the west of the Indian Ocean. Now, I live in the Central Plateau, and this is really called the heart of the island. We're elevated about, some 200, 230 meters high up. And there is a beautiful mountain range where a lot of the phenomena that I have seen has taken place. And there is a rather large mountain, it's a landmark of Mauritius, called Peter Both. And again, we can see a small, strange-looking rock that seems perfectly balanced on top of the tip of the mountain. And I would encourage everybody just to maybe perhaps do a quick Google. This mountain's called Pieterboth, and that's Pieter, and then the second word is Both, which is spelt both, Both. And you can see this rock that's not actually balancing. It looks like it is, but it's not. It's actually carved or eroded, and it's very strange. It looks like a head. It's looking towards the north of the island. And I should mention at this point, when I was working in the north of the island, one evening I drove back past this landmark mountain, and over the head of this mountain, this sort of strange rock that appears to be balancing on the tip, I saw what I can only describe as a tear-shaped sort of silver object that was just floating above this mountain and this particular pinnacle. And again, the weather was perfectly clear, blue skies, and it reminded me of something that we might see in some of the medieval artwork of Europe, where we can see these strange tear-shaped or teardrop-shaped objects with people in them. I mean, it was truly weird, and over a very strange-looking mountain. There's another place in the south of the island called Suillac, and in Suillac there is a rock that's basically called the Crying Rock, because it's a face that is looking over the sea, and it sort of cries when the sea comes up against it.
I was going to say we're up against a break there, but I definitely want to talk some more about that when we come back on the other side. I want to get into some of these. Not only the interesting aspects of the island, but also the interesting things that you've seen in the sky over it. And don't forget, if anybody has any questions, you can shoot them into the wormhole. I have a couple that have come in that we'll ask JP on the other side. So we have a lot to get to and just a little bit of time to get to it. So stay tuned. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more with JP Hague here on Midnight in the Desert. And we return now with more Midnight in the Desert. We'll get right back into it with our guest JP Hague in just a moment. But I want to remind everybody, don't forget that each Sunday we put out a post on the Midnight in the Desert Facebook page that tells you exactly what the guest lineup is going to be for the week ahead. But I'm going to cheat a little bit tonight, and I'm going to tell you some of the shows that we have coming up next week, just a few. But you'll be very interested to know that I will get the chance for the first time to interview Dr. Barry Taff on St. Patrick's Day, which reminds me that anybody out there that has a leprechaun photo, you can share it with us on the Midnight in the Desert Facebook page. We have a post right there for you to share it. Just go down on the page and you'll see that we're asking you to share a photo of a leprechaun. It could be, maybe your dog or cat dressed up as a leprechaun. Maybe you dressed up as a leprechaun, but maybe, just maybe, you have an actual photo of a leprechaun that you want to share with us. So that's there for you. And we'll talk about that on St. Patrick's Day as we discuss things with Dr. Barry Taff. And I also want to let everybody know that on Wednesday of next week, it's going to be the return of Mr. Black. I know a lot of you out there thought that I had killed him the last time that he was on the show, but Mr. Black is fine. He's alive and well, and he's going to tell us exactly what happened that last time that he was on Midnight in the Desert. I'll be honest with you. I was a little bit concerned that maybe I had done Mr. Black in that interview. So I haven't lost any yet, JP. Hopefully you make it through this interview in one piece. Are you still there, JP?
Sorry, yes, Tim.
Okay.
I just had a little a glitch with my mic, but I'm back here.
You made me nervous there because I said I haven't lost one yet, and you're still with us. And
No, I've got to tell you here, I don't know if you guys can hear this, but there is an enormous tropical rainstorm that's passing overhead, and it's deafening. So I'm hoping that you can just hear my voice and not the forces of Mother Nature that seem to be engulfing my home at this very moment in time.
No, it's coming in. It sounds perfect. All we can hear is you. But I love the fact that you're getting that kind of weather, because it just makes it even better to talk about the kind of things we're talking about tonight.
It's amazing. I mean, the whole week there's been all the schools have been closed. Independence Day ceremonies yesterday were cancelled. I mean, it's a kind of a funny. I mean, the rain is very heavy and loud, and it's probably absolutely linked to that. But it sort of coincides with this coronavirus issue that's plaguing the world. And it's very convenient that people should be restrained and not attending schools and mixing at a time of the year where people are doing exactly the opposite on any other time. So it's interesting.
It's like for the last week, all I've had running through my head, the soundtrack in my head is O Fortuna, the opening of the Carmina Burana, which is like the ultimate apocalypse song. And it's just been in my head all week long. So it sounds like that storm would fit right in.
Yeah, no, it's very, very dramatic. And, there is, we have a history of heavy and dangerous cyclones that have hit the island. And in fact, one of the cases I was going to talk about later was it happened immediately after the last major cyclone that hit the island in February of 1994. So, we're quite accustomed to difficult weather and we just adapt and make the best of things that we can.
Well, let's get into some of those cases. Do you want to tackle that one first, or?
All right. Well, I have a lot of examples are personal experience, and there are also others, obviously, that I meet and have got to know, and their cases are equally incredible. In fact, yes, I'll go into this case that happened, as I mentioned, in February of 1994. Now, at that time, there was a devastating cyclone, and that was called Hollander, which is like the word Holland or Netherlands with an A on the end. And this thing passed over the island between the 8th and 11th of February in 94. The winds hit something like 135 miles per hour, which was, formidable for fairly basic infrastructure on the island. At the time, there was a lot of devastation. The electricity supply was limited to about 40%. There was no electricity for a couple of weeks. Fresh water even was cut for a matter of days, from what I can understand. But anyway, there is this aspect of UFO or UAP appearing in the wake of or during natural disasters, and this is no exception. So basically, we're looking at a part of the island called Tamarin. It's on the west coast, and there's more exposure. There's a mountain there, and then you have the coast and the residences that are situated below. And the west coast is highly active. There's so many reports coming in from this coast, and this case really, for me, kind of is emblematic of the type of activity that's going on. So let's get straight into it. On Sunday, the 11th of February in 94, there'd been an intense summer heat, and the power, the water supply was failing anyway. And this lasted for around 3 weeks. So at the time, the witness, who's a personal friend of mine, she's now in her 70s. She was a young mum at the time, and her children were fairly young. They're now my age, aged around 38. And at this time, her husband had gone on a long business trip to Madagascar for several weeks. So on this fateful day of the 11th of February in 1994, at around 10 a.m. it was a Sunday morning, she was basically doing some sewing in her living room because there wasn't much else to do. And her son was then around 11. And at that point in time, he cried out with excitement from the veranda and said to his mum to come and see what was happening on the sea. So he'd been watching something that was happening since around 9 a.m. that morning. So the witness went to the veranda. She recalled seeing plenty of boats out on the water, other nautical activities, which is quite normal. But then she saw that there was this huge light on the water, and this thing was probably several kilometers away from where she was stood. So whatever the object was, she thought that it was probably reflecting the morning sunlight. The son then turns to her and says that he's seen several lights jumping in and out of the water, and he was glued to the veranda watching this for much of the day. So if we fast forward to 6 p.m. of that day, the witness then goes out again onto the veranda, notices that the same large light had basically remained stationary in the sky, hadn't moved an inch, and she's thinking to herself, well, it's probably a boat that's on the water with unusually strange floodlights of some kind, maybe a fishing vessel. Doesn't seem very likely, but that's what she thought at the time. So no sooner had the thought really crossed her mind, it's probably a boat. And again, this is this telepathic element we opened the show with. This large light energetically just darted up into the sky, in the air, from where it was hovering above the water. It still remains several kilometers away, but it was close enough for, she thinks, the occupants or shipping to have seen this thing at the same time. The object then slowly began to move towards the mainland, and it became apparent to this witness there were some 4 other smaller lights or bright objects surrounding this larger object. So she was now thinking, this is actually getting much closer now. It was now hovering over a shoreline watchtower, and these smaller lights that I just mentioned appeared to be guiding this larger object, which was radiating light. The group of lights remained stationary over this watchtower for maybe around 20 minutes. So the boy, or the son's excitement was beginning to scare the witness at this time. He was young and he found this incredible. Her daughter, who was a bit older, 2 years older, she was 12 at this time, she was quite indifferent to the phenomena that was taking place throughout the day. She went back to the house, she made the children dinner, and predictably the son was so excited he wanted to eat outside and have his dinner while watching the objects that were stationed nearby. So that was the opening. At around 7 p.m., which is twilight, darkness fell, and everything changed from this moment. The son suddenly screamed. The large object was now hovering directly over the family's house. The object's diameter was probably in excess of the house itself. It remained there for several minutes. The witness immediately returned inside the house with the children because she was concerned for their safety. She had no idea what she was looking at. She could hear a loud movement of air or wind, but could not feel the sensation of the wind against her skin. The TV was crackling loudly with static noise. This is very common in these cases, and as we know from science fiction. And in fact, I would say at this point that I think that science fiction is drawing from science fact. So Dominique, the witness, she was present-minded at this point, but she was really primarily concerned with calming her son and daughter down. Around 30 minutes later, not really knowing what to do, she put the children to bed because this was the sort of the routine that they had. She didn't check to see whether the object was above the house. She didn't understand what was happening. She was confused, but she just simply wanted to avoid exciting her son any further. The dogs were barking and acting strangely. They wouldn't eat their dinner, which they normally would at this time. They were pacing up and down the house in, she says, an agitated fashion. So now we're moving to 9 p.m. of that evening. So eventually her son falls asleep, but within an hour of falling asleep, he wakes up. The witness then goes to his bedroom, and she was shocked to find him missing from his bed. The dogs are now audibly whimpering in fear. The veranda door is open. The witness finds her son on the veranda in hysterics. The craft is now, or object, is hovering above the trees located on a neighbor's property. And this bright or main object was obviously now to her the size of the neighbor's house. And these smaller illuminated objects were circling the core, rotating around the body of the craft, the main craft. And she thinks that each of these smaller satellite-type objects were larger than an average family car. So not that small, really. So at this point, she's now acutely afraid. She sprints to a small cottage that's located on her land, maybe around 30 meters away. And this was tenanted or occupied by a Frenchman who was living in this property at the time. She just burst through the front door because she was just so scared she didn't think to knock. And she found the guy asleep. But he couldn't be woken up. She was violently shaking him out of fear. He still wouldn't wake up. She then ran out of the cottage, and then she noticed that this craft proceeded to hover low above the grass on the neighboring land. The smaller lights are still rotating around it. And then she decided, well, I can't deal with this. I need to run back to this cottage and try and wake up this guy to protect me. But it was totally futile. He still wouldn't wake up. She then re-exits or leaves the cottage, and this main craft that's now apparent to her that it's the shape of a sort of two-tiered metallic disc suddenly begins to sharply rotate to 90 degrees towards her. So it was flat, and now it's showing the belly of the craft to her on a perfect 90-degree horizontal. Oh, sorry, on the vertical, on its side. So it's revealing this rounded disc underbelly. She says that there were several lights on the outer edge. There was a large dark spot in the middle. Each light was moving independently of the others, and it was almost like a chaotic light show. That's how she describes it. She then runs up to the garden. She's running up a mountain face here because the property's on the side of this mountain in Tamarin. And she thought to wake up another neighbor. So this guy's house is around 100 meters away this time, so it's much further away. She thought that her son was following her in pursuit in the confusion and the stress of the situation. She gets to the neighbor's home. She rushes onto the veranda, begins frantically banging at the door and shouting, but nobody answers, even though she knows that they're home, and the car is parked outside. So now her thoughts are directed to her daughter, who's still, she thinks, in the family home. So then she runs back all the way back down the 100 meters back to her home, and she can only think of her daughter. So throughout these two journeys to and from the neighbor's house and on the neighboring land, she's aware of these smaller objects and lights were following her, these satellite objects to the main craft. As she's coming back down towards her home, she realizes that actually her son is no longer with her. She approaches the house, and she's stunned to see her son, her 10-year-old son, standing in bare feet no more than 1 meter away from this craft on the vacant neighboring land. He's standing still. He appeared to be looking for a way to get into the craft. And at this point, she says she screamed to her son to return to her. And apparently he calmly turns around, and walks back towards her. So at this time, the craft had resumed a sort of horizontal position, a flat disc shaped. And she could now see that it was definitely a flat disc, that it had a thinly raised upper deck section positioned immediately above it. Inside, she can see 3 to 4 distinct and sharply defined shadows. And those shadows were humanoid in shape. The heads were described as large and something like 50% larger than our head or cranium, and the torso was very slender. The most memorable feature of these shadow-type beings was their very long and thin arms that would have ended by their knees, where the hands would be. And this part of the craft is situated in the middle of the upper deck, and one of them appears to be operating the craft by lights. And there are lights that are rapidly moving next to his arms. So she's assuming that these are the craft's controls. The other 2 or 3 beings were, she says, busying themselves as if to support the pilot. So the whole thing was extremely chaotic. She then goes back into the house. She rips her son away. She notices that inside the house, the contents were knocking or rattling against each other. The electrical appliances are making a loud static noise. And she basically bunkers in to the daughter's bedroom with the 3 of them. And this bright illumination of blue light is literally just being emitted from the dark spot underneath the belly of the craft, and it's penetrating the room as if the walls aren't there. The curtains are statically charged, she thinks. They're being lifted up into the air, and the curtains are emitting a static sound. The daughter is hiding under her duvet. She's screaming for her mum. The mum, the witness, then takes her daughter and her son, and they go into the master bedroom, which is in a more central position in the house. She also took the dogs in as well. So despite the intense summer heat, with all this going on, she locked them in the room. She shuts all the windows and doors while the contents are banging around, being shaken. There's this static noise that's pervading the whole home. And then she returns back to the bedroom with her kids and the dogs, turns the light off, and they all get into bed and fall asleep. She recalls waking up at 7 a.m. and the following day. Daylight at that time, or daybreak, is around 5:30 a.m. The children, the dogs, they're all still beside her, but the electronic appliances and all the items are continuing to produce a static noise, but to a lesser degree. They then start to resume family life as if nothing's happened. She gets the kids fed and showered and ready for school. She asks her son, "Are you going to tell anybody about this at school?" And he just simply replies, "Why should I? I can understand that." Following the incident, neighbors and friends inspected the landing site the following morning. The telephone line wasn't working for several days, and she couldn't contact her husband in Madagascar. Nothing has grown where this craft landed, and in the end, the neighbor put in a swimming pool because the land was literally dead. It was torched by what was hovering over it, or may have even landed. Following the event, she contacted the Met Office, and the head of the Met Office at that time, Mr. Boudou, spoke to her and actually confirmed that the radar at the nearby beach and weather station had blew up the same day of the incident, and that it had detected activity that same day, and that he personally has seen objects in the sky over this region of Flic-en-Flac and Tamarin, where they're based. So lots of strange things. Another occurrence after the event that I should mention is that Dominique was approached by I don't know, maybe something like 10 people that had traveled all the way from Australia, claiming to be journalists who were interested in the case, that they were going to do a report and they would send her the article. Well, they interrogated her and she never heard from them since. So possibly they were, intelligence agents at the time that were stationed in Australia, and there really wasn't the presence that there is now in Mauritius. That's a possibility. But the incident didn't really end there. The husband returned from his trip to Madagascar, and 10 days after, the craft returned to the area, and it was seen hovering over the complex where they lived. It would contour the mountain next to which they were based, and it would shoot off back into the sea. Sometimes with, sometimes without these orbiting objects. Again, like we mentioned during the section where I talked about the kind of cultural, religious ties of the island, people are scared and fear being ridiculed. And so, her husband has basically buried this under the carpet. He won't talk about it. He saw this craft with her. He believes his wife, but he refuses to talk about it. And when I went to meet the witness who's become a friend, he just basically spent half of the day away because he's deeply uncomfortable with this. So I think, Mauritius is still coming to terms with this reality and slowly learning about it, whereas, you guys in the States are light years ahead, where the survey suggests huge numbers of Americans consider the phenomena to be real. So we're just at a different point in our development here. Interesting point connected to the witness. She has family based in Somerset, the southwest of the UK. And some 10 years later, after this incident that took place after the hurricane, and this was in 2004, her sister says that she saw UFOs in Egypt, and that the father had seen UFOs throughout World War II. So, it's interesting that other family members have seen things. She also has a friend in South Africa who claims to have had an abduction experience that was deeply unpleasant. So there are connections to the witnesses. I do find that there is this notion of entanglement between experiencers or contactees, whatever we want to term them. The witness does think that, back to Mauritius, that inside the mountain where this occurred, there is a base. I personally think that it links to the real base, which is probably under the bed of rock underneath the ocean on the west coast. She's heard many accounts of a landing site on the mountain. And I've actually personally had my own interactive experiences with an object situated over this mountain when visiting a friend who happens to be my dentist as well. And it's a very, very strange place. And that incident with me, by the way, took place in February of I think it was 2015. So, in this case, she felt that the presence was not negative or evil by any stretch of the imagination, but it was traumatic because it was so shocking and scary. And it often makes me think of Whitley Strieber's experience and inspiration for the book Communion that he made. So, I think it's interesting. We have all these particularities of regions around the world, but ultimately it doesn't really matter where we live. It's all happening. It's all connected. The origins are probably the same or similar. So we're just really trying to piece the puzzle together. So that was a major case that took place on the West Coast.
What about that case with you and your dentist?
Oh, well, that was interesting. I was driving to the same location where he lives. We were just going to have dinner and a few drinks together at his home. And as I was driving towards the location, I could see a very unusual light in the sky. Instinctively, I said it's probably something unnatural, but I can't jump to conclusions. I'll just keep it in the back of my head, focus on the road. I then got to his house and we had dinner. The object then slowly descended further down, just above the mountaintop itself. It was very low. and it began to kind of blink at us. And I just basically, we had some fun with it. I was asking questions and it was blinking in reply. And it seemed to be suggesting, I sort of tried to ask if it was from this physical reality, and it did. I said, can you blink once for yes and two for no? I just kept it simple. And it sort of suggested that it was. I asked if it had traveled from another place within this universe, and the answer was yes. I asked, are you 1 to 3 light years from this planet? Nothing. Are you 3 to 5 light years from this planet? And then it blinked. So, I mean, there was, a number of other questions, but it was nothing compared to her particular encounter. I've had much more up close and personal encounters, but it's linked to that specific location where there's so much. There's also been a craft the size of 2 to 3 football fields that has appeared with people looking from this mountain, and I call it the equivalent of the Phoenix Lights that took place in 1997 in Phoenix, Arizona. Very similar in scale. It took a curved, delta-shaped appearance, but it was much more colorful. There were smaller lights. I have a video that is 10 minutes in length, and this was taken in August of 2010, if I remember correctly. And you can hear the witnesses talking. They're phoning. One of them is phoning his father. You can hear the wind on the mountain. So it feels authentic to me. I know the witness. I absolutely believe that this person is telling the truth. And it's amazing. And there were 5 of them on the mountain. Curious thing is that after they, and this lasted over several hours, and just before daybreak, they went to relax in their car, and one of them saw a being that he describes as small and childlike. If he had to hazard a guess at what it looked like, he would have said a grey, but he can't be sure. And it literally parted the grass or the sugarcane behind the car with its 2 arms, passed across the road, and disappeared. So there's some really amazing stuff that's happening on the West Coast. I think there are other links. Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say we're up against a break, but we can pick that up when we come back on the other side of it. We are going to wrap up things with our guest tonight, JP Hague. So if you have any questions that you want to try to get in, you can shoot them into the wormhole at midnightinthedesert.com. But fair warning, we still have a lot of stuff that I want to cover with JP. So we'll try and get to some of those questions as we can, but we're going to get into some of the bigger picture answers as to what this could all be about. So we'll talk more about that when we come back with JP Hague with more Midnight in the Desert in just a few moments. When Art Bell started doing this type of radio all those years ago, radio was a simple procedure. One man talked into a microphone, millions of people listened. Now radio has changed, things are different, and things can be more interactive. And we thank all of you out there for listening to Midnight in the Desert every night. We thank you for becoming time travelers and helping to support the show. But what we really need from you is to help us spread the word. You are the best advocates we have for this program. You are the ones that can let the rest of the world know that we still have radio the way it used to be, radio the way it should be, and you can get it every single weeknight right here at Midnight in the Desert. We're so glad that you join us every night as we take the ride, but bring along your friends as well and let them take the ride too. And we are back with Midnight in the Desert, our final segment tonight with guest JP Hague. And JP, before the break, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we were talking about the equivalent of the Phoenix Lights case for Mauritius.
Yeah, that's right, Tim, and no problem. I mean, to be honest, there's so much material and analysis to get through. It's probably best that we just focus on the areas that you specifically want me to go into in the next half an hour. So I was going into the Tamarin Lights, which is very similar to the Phoenix Lights. Absolutely amazing story. Again, there is lots of entanglement with the witness who happened to be chasing the first major UFO sighting that I experienced here in Mauritius back in September of 2013, which was a very, very large, bright burning elliptical shaped object that was probably kilometers or miles in width. I thought I was hallucinating, so I went to bed. And the next morning it was discussed on the radio. So anyway, there is this concept of entanglement. This particular witness, who was assisted by others at the time, he's had very strange things occurring in his own home. I'll give you a small example that's quite amusing. He was watching the film Ice Age in his apartment. There was a total mess at the time, the Disney franchise. He and his friend fell asleep. He woke up after the film had ended. The entire apartment had been cleaned up, and he, maybe a day later, found the DVD placed in the center of the freezer. And there was nobody else that entered that property after they woke, in the time that they'd fallen asleep and woken up, say, an hour or so later. So, I mean, very strange kind of trickster-like elements to this. It's almost like it's having fun with the witnesses on occasion. I don't necessarily think that this is negative, but, we have to ask ourselves, why do we humans have a sense of humor? It's not necessary to evolution and survival in the strictest sense, but it's very much a part of the palette of our being. So anyway, very interesting. The Phoenix Lights and the Tamarin Lights. I'd explained, that it had happened throughout a night in August of 2010. It was the 27th of August. And it took place for maybe 5 hours on the day in question on the very same mountain where the witness I'd spoken of before had her experience in 1994 following Hurricane Hollander. The footage is captured on a Sony SLR camera, 2010 technology, which isn't great at the time because they're not really into the light sensitivity at that point in time. And this took place around 3 a.m. And he kept it under lock and key. I was one of only a few people that had seen the footage. So I was very grateful. The strange thing that I didn't have time to mention is that a week before even meeting this witness, as I'm walking out from the local supermarket or shopping mall, small shopping mall that's close to where I live, I believe I saw the same object as I was walking out. My mother was over from the UK visiting our family, and it basically just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. I came out around 7:30 p.m. in the evening, and a serpent-like flash of light just began to strike up. This thing was dominating the skyline. I would hazard a guess that it was probably a couple of miles in width. And it was totally beautiful, and it sort of morphed into different shapes. It definitely took a delta or curve shape at one point. And this happened over maybe like 20 seconds. So this happened to me as I'm walking out of the supermarket. And then within a week of that incident, I then meet this witness who tells me about his experience and passes me the footage of the Tamarin Lights that happened, maybe 6 or so years before. So again, there's this aspect of entanglement and teasing and connecting the dots that it's almost, we're being teased, but we're not being given the full answer on a plate. But it was truly strange, and I feel very privileged to have been able to see this object that was enormous. And there's been a lot of similar activity where I live here in the Central Plateau. There's been cigar-shaped craft, again, kilometers in length, communication of a kind with craft approaching and flashing and interacting with both myself and a friend of mine who lives close by. And she's a yoga teacher, and we attend a yoga class together. That's how we met one another. But as I said, the Tamarin Lights from 2010, this thing was 2 to 3 football fields in breadth. It was a delta-shaped craft. The witnesses describe a light show taking place over several hours. And as I also mentioned, they went to rest for a while in the car. The main witness, who I know, sat in the front passenger seat with a friend in the driver's seat. The 2 other companions are sat in the rear. And then suddenly all 4 of these occupants feel a breeze penetrate the vehicle. Now, if you remember, there was this aspect of a wind or breeze or sound of it that was taking place at in 1994 when there was the disc appearance on the same area. And what was even stranger was that he said that this was accompanied by like a whisper stating his name. So instinctively, he then suddenly turns, he looks into the passenger wing rearview mirror, and he's stunned to momentarily glimpse a clothed being the size of a child rapidly moving through the tall grass situated at the rear of the car. And he recalls this being parting the blades of grass with his hands, It's done quickly, it's stealthy, it's purposeful, and then it disappears. And as I mentioned, again, he probably would go for the grey species if he had to identify it, but he can't be sure. Sunrise happened at around 6:30, and at the moment of the sun rising, the craft was said to have instantaneously vanished, almost like a cloaking device was being used or activated at that point. So that really is the story, but it really requires a view of the footage, which unfortunately we can't do right now. But at my presentation at the Laughlin UFO Mega Conference, I basically showed the sort of most interesting 2 minutes, and it really is worthwhile watching.
Well, let's get into some of the ideas as to what these things could be all about, and some of the different ways of looking at them.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, first I'm just going to factually summarize what I have experienced through my own experiences and others in Mauritius. I mean, first, there is definitely this mental and telepathic element that connects to a physical or ethereal manifestation. There's often colorful visuals. There is often a shift along the color spectrum of visible light. Often we can see orange and red when they're phasing in and out. And I can address this in a minute. That's interesting. I've had, and others, feelings, physical sensations, mental impressions. There are multiple types of beings that appear in dreams often, visions, and perhaps less often in regular consciousness. And these two cases are quite exceptional in that regard. I do think there is a self-regulating ecosystem. It's not just one type of being. The origins of all these manifestations and beings, that's another question altogether. Metaphysical contact in the meditative state, that often happens. And this kind of state of consciousness appears to allow the intelligence to interact with those that I know and myself, and is a preferred mode of contact. As I mentioned earlier, there is this form of entanglement and crossovers, or so-called coincidences with people that we know. It's ongoing. The pieces seem to fall into place along the way. It's like a path of initiation. Nothing is delivered on a silver platter. There are oddities in Mauritius. There are pyramids. There is a satellite base. There is an energetic point known as the vortex in the south. And this is a highly active area that needs to be investigated. Now, one author, sometimes, we have to go back in time in order to advance forward. And there was one researcher, a legendary journalist and UFO researcher and author, John Keel, who I really admire because he seriously looked into this phenomena and dug up all the scientific research. But at the same time, much like myself, he was having personal experiences. So you'll get the kind of research in the first part of his books, and then at the back, he's putting in this kind of parallel existence that he's living whilst he's looking into the phenomena. And it really struck a chord with me. He wrote two amazing books in the late 60s and early 70s. The first is Operation Trojan Horse, which is a phenomenal book that really is a landmark in ufology. And the second is called The Eighth Tower, and that was written in the 70s. And this is really interesting because what he talks about in a smaller section in Trojan Horse, but really goes into this so-called ultra-terrestrial super spectrum that's happening beyond visible light. He says that visible light is really covering a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum and is really comprising of tiny pulses of energy. We call these wavelengths, and it's like, I guess I would say, snapping rubber bands almost that are producing this energy. The longest wavelength in visible light is red, and the shortest is violet. And incidentally, I mean, it's slightly esoteric when we look into yoga and the chakras. The scientific order of the colors is in the order of the chakras, from the lowest, which is red, to the highest above the head or the crown, which is violet. So beyond visible light, we have infrared, but this can emit heat, which UFO contactees and experiences like myself have experienced. It's almost like what we're seeing is a massive energy from parts of this invisible spectrum in terms of the manifestation of the craft. Let's not deal with the beings. Let's take the craft for now. Into the visible spectrum, and then they're returning back into this invisible spectrum, And there is a transition through the proper order of light. And John Keel was the first researcher to basically articulate what it was that I was starting to see. And he also suggests that those with so-called psychic abilities can see into the infrared and the ultraviolet strata of light. And, that like from my point of view, that these are amplified by areas of the Earth that are naturally more electromagnetic. And, we bring in the concept of these ley lines or dragon lines, as we talked about earlier. And I think Mauritius is basically one of these hotspots. So this is really how, a sort of high-level look at, what's happening beyond visible light and what's coming in. I mean, there's CIA documents that are now published. There's one from 2011 that's talking about intra or ultra-dimensional beings or extraterrestrials. The author and the circumstances of the document that I'm talking about is not clear, but it feels accurate and prescient. It's predictive. It talks about, parts of the disks that we see are carrying crews, much like the case that I described earlier. Others are under remote control, which I think I've experienced too. It talks about peaceful missions and that the visitors contemplate settling on this plane. So they're visitors into this plane of existence. They're human-like, but some are much larger in size. They are not excarnate Earth people, but they come from their own world within that dimension. And in fact, they don't necessarily come from any planet. We use the word planet, but from an etheric planet, which interpenetrates with our own and is basically imperceptible to us. So he talked about, the document talks about the bodies of the visitors and the craft automatically materialize on entering the vibrancy of our dense matter or vibrational plane. Some of the objects possess a type of radiant energy or array, which will disintegrate any attacking ship or aircraft. And we know that this has been happening. There are incidences in Iran in the late 70s. We know about Russian fighter jets that have been literally taken out and the pilots have been killed on showing aggression. The document talks about these objects re-entering the etheric at will. So they literally disappear from our vision without any trace. And this is all very common. The region, it says, from which they come is not necessarily the astral plane, which we kind of associate with dreams and human interactions beyond the physical. But he, the author, links it to the lokas or the talas, which are esoteric Indian mystical concepts. So students of esoterism will probably understand these terms a bit better. They're sort of other planes of existence or worlds. These beings cannot be reached by radio, the document says, but it can probably be done through radar if a signal system can be devised for that apparatus. So this is a really unusual document that's sort of been put in there, and I feel is really quite accurate. I mean, there are different lenses through which we can try and understand this, and I've looked into theoretical and applied quantum science for the multiverse. I think that it's a reasonable and a rational thing to say that there are multiple dimensions or existences, and the science is really catching up. It's almost as if the science is catching up with what the esoteric science, and by the way, esoterism simply means that which is within, eso from Latin. So perhaps it's that all these truths are actually locked up within us. We know the answers, we have the knowledge, but we're just not actively connecting with that through our conscious minds because of the limitation of the five senses. So I really do think that we need to understand the science, the explanation, but there is this innermost esoteric aspect that is also going to give us more answers than just simply using mental and academic knowledge. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that science and spirituality are probably two sides of the same coin, and we really need to study all aspects of this coin in order to get the answers that we're looking for.
And it seems like that's absolutely the case when talking about this type of phenomena, because it leads to, and I bring this up with a lot of different types of paranormal activity, but certainly with the UFO experiences that you're describing, it's almost like it exists solely to have a human observation. So without the human aspect of it, does it even happen?
Absolutely. Completely agree with you. I mean, there was a theory called panpsychism, and that says that the universe could be capable of consciousness, which could change all understanding. So, I mean, for quite some time, the scientists have been trying to understand the universe, where it came from, why we're here, but they often come up short with the answer. So until, I think it was Gregory Matloff, he came up with this idea. He's a physicist at the New York College of Technology. In 2017, he publishes this paper, and he says that humans could be like the rest of the universe in substance and in spirit, whereby a so-called proto-consciousness field could extend through all space. So basically what he's saying is that the entire cosmos could be self-aware, so nothing is separate. We are literally all one presence, as we hear in not just the New Age movements, but in the ancient traditions and religions. So yeah, it's fascinating. And there was another guy. He was Mr. Koch from the Allen Institute for Brain Science. I think that was the institution, but don't quote me on that. I think he says that basically biological organisms are conscious because they approach a new situation, and then they adapt their behavior in order to basically thwart or avoid a bad situation. And he's basically using this kind of premise to try and see if, you can measure the level of consciousness that are being displayed. So the dominant theory we have of consciousness says that it's associated with complexity. So in other words, a system's ability to act on its own state and determine its own fate. So this panpsychism theory is that consciousness could infuse with very simple systems, let's say organic matter like a rock, and that this means that some purely physical systems that are not biological or organic may also be conscious. And this is fascinating. It just changes all the rules of the game. I think from a sort of psychological perspective, Tim, you mentioned this sort of, the necessity almost of the human observer for this to happen, and this sort of co-dependency. And, what really springs to mind is the work of Carl Jung. And in fact, his last ever work was on flying saucers. And in private, he was absolutely persuaded about this connection and this reality. On a public and publishing scale, he was much more conservative. And this is what I often find. There is this sort of almost fear-like aspect to coming out with the phenomenon. It's happening less. A very good friend of mine is a well-known physicist who works with the likes of Michio Kaku. His name is Deep Prasad. And he's a wonderful guy. He's working on quantum technologies to improve how we work and live. But he's had a contact experience, and it totally changed his worldview on this subject. And he was a fellow speaker at the Laughlin Mega Conference too. So, things are changing. Carl Jung basically is saying that we are co-creating this phenomena. He really started to look at this at a time of deep fear and uncertainty. It was during the sort of heart of the Cold War, if you will. And he published this book on flying saucers in 1958. I think he concluded that it was more desirable for people to believe that UFOs exist than to believe that they don't. He was privately convinced, as I mentioned, but he was concerned about this public perception of his interest. And in that final work, which is simply called Flying Saucers, something like, I don't know, a study of myth or the mythology of things, he says that, the phenomena ties into the concept of synchronicity, which is a term that was coined by Carl Jung, where external events, so we're talking about an era of fear and uncertainty in the Cold War, mirror internal psychic states. So, he's seeing this UFO situation in a broader perspective than most. And for Jung, the images had much to do with the ending of an era in history and the beginning of a new one. So, in his concluding remarks, he really nails this. He's saying that in nature, the clock is active and that it's continually moving and passing from one cycle to another. There are vital periods that cause social, psychological change to the life of the individual, and this is distinct to the life of the collective of humans on the planet. And the individuals, as we know from his other work, are bound by the change of archetype or psychic dominant to that of the collective. So I suppose, to draw a parallel, the medieval alchemists projected their psyche into matter. And I think that Jung is basically saying that, modern man is projecting his inner state also in that day and age and today into the heavens, into the celestial realm. So in this sense, the UFOs became modern symbols for the ancient gods, which came to man's assistance in the time of need. And I don't think it's a coincidence, Tim, that in the 50s particularly, or the late 40s, when the flying saucer term came up, that these objects are round, and the circle has a very significant shape to it. It's a sign of unity. It's a sign of wholeness at a time when, the Iron Curtain was drawn, and we might expect all sorts of strange things to come out of this deep fear and uncertainty of the human psyche at this time. So the fact that the flying saucers and a lot of these objects today that are even more exotic, are round, circular, is interesting. I mean, ancient mandalas, according to the Buddhists, that are round, are symbols of wholeness. And these have been seen throughout human history. I'm also thinking in the esoteric sense of, being in the Indian Ocean. I think of the Hindu deity Vishnu, the preserver and protector of man. And he's basically protecting us against absolute law without mercy. So he's about balance. And what he holds in one of his forearms at the back is a chakra, and it's a circular chakra, which is actually the national symbol of India. If you look at the Indian flag, it's on there, and it's called Sudarshan chakra. It's a spinning disc-like weapon that apparently means disc of auspicious vision. There's 108 serrated edges. There's 108 nadis, or energy channels, or we can call them meridians in Chinese medicine, in the human body. So the number 108 is relevant. The word itself, Sudarshana, which is the name of the chakra, is a combination of two words, Su, which means divine, and Darshana, which means vision. So the word Sudarshana translates to divine vision. It's fascinating. I think that, we are being given pieces to the puzzle. It's perhaps so obvious, but, to say that often these objects are circular, but it's a starting point. Everything is being communicated in symbols, and it's appealing to a deeper nature of ourselves that's often hidden from the conscious mind.
Right, absolutely. Well, we're just about out of time, JP, but this has been a fascinating discussion, and I love the way that you look at these from all different types of approaches. Even though you've had your own experiences, you are still willing to look beyond just that and look into the bigger picture. So hopefully you can join us again sometime and we can dive even deeper into this.
Oh, I'd love to, Tim. Thank you. Yes, it's been wonderful being able to share with you and your listeners. I think you're doing an amazing job, and you should keep it up. And I'm very happy to come back and we can explore some of these other areas, because there is so much to cover, and the journey is ongoing. It's literally when you turn the key, there's no looking back. You open the doors of perception, and as I'm sure you know, it's an ongoing journey of initiation that never really ends.
Absolutely. Well, that'll do it for tonight's show. We'll be back tomorrow night when our guest will be Vincent Jenna. We'll be talking about some of the superstitions and some of the legends and lore of Friday the 13th. So you don't want to miss that, because, it's technically Friday the 13th where I am, but I think we'll have a lot of luck with that discussion tomorrow night. So make sure that you tune in for that. And if any time you miss any part of one of the programs, just become a time traveler at midnightinthedesert.com, and you can go back and listen to it. You're going to want to go back and listen to tonight's show again, I promise you, because so much great conversation tonight with both of our guests. Another fantastic show, and dare I say, one that really has that classic Art Bell feel. So that'll do it for tonight. Until tomorrow, for Keith, for Michelle, for Tracy, and everybody in the Midnight Society, from the high desert via the spooky South Coast,